Is the controversy over Palestinian textbooks genuine or contrived for political motives? What does it tell us about the Palestinians, Israel, and the international dimensions of the question of Palestine? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Martin Konečný. Martin Konečný is the founder and director of the European Middle East Project, an independent NGO in Brussels promoting just and effective European Union policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Konečný has closely followed EU foreign policy as an analyst and advocate for over a decade, and is often consulted by European officials and media. He previously worked as a Senior Policy Analyst at the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels and served as Brussels Director at Crisis Action, where he coordinated advocacy efforts on multiple conflicts, including Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, and Israel-Palestine. Martin Konečný also has prior experience working for international environmental organizations and as a journalist in the Czech Republic. Martin Konečný, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Hello, Mouin. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. I'd like to start by asking you to summarize the issue for the uninitiated. Nathan Brown of George Washington University, who published the first major study of the Palestinian curriculum for the Adam Institute in 2001, has pointed out that the controversy is as old as the occupation, but in its current form emerged from Palestinian efforts to develop their own curriculum after the Palestinian Authority was established in the mid-1990s. In Brown's words, and I'm quoting, "The Palestinian curriculum is not a war curriculum. While highly nationalistic, it does not incite hatred, violence, and anti-Semitism. It cannot be described as a peace curriculum either, but the charges against it are often wildly exaggerated or inaccurate," end quote. Brown also points out that foreign governments paid scant attention to this issue until 1998, when an Israeli organization, the Center for Monitoring the Impact of Peace, issued a report on the Palestinian curriculum, whose scathing conclusions were matched only by the shoddiness of its research. So my question to you is, what are the main elements of this debate as it has developed over the past several decades?
Right. So I come to this actually through the EU angle, the European Union being based in Brussels, because the issue is currently getting an extraordinary amount of attention here already for the last year. And this is indeed a kind of a peak of this issue, which has been around for, as you said, for more than 2 decades. It started basically after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which started in the late 90s, issuing its own textbooks. Until then,
yes, please.
Before the PA was established, the Israeli occupation authorities censored the Palestinian textbooks every year. They were taking out, whole sections and whole books. And despite the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza learning with these Israeli censored textbooks, which were issued actually or based on Jordanian textbooks, it was at that time when we saw the height of Palestinian attacks and violence in the second Intifada, while the generation that grew up with these textbooks issued by the PA, which are criticized so much, there hasn't been a comparable record in terms of attacks. So I think this belies empirically the foundation of this whole narrative that it's the textbooks which are primarily driving violence in this context.
And just to be clear, prior to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the textbooks that were used in Palestinian schools were the Jordanian curriculum in the West Bank, including eventually East Jerusalem, and the Egyptian textbooks in the Gaza Strip, reflecting the administration that these territories were under between 1948 and 1967. But these textbooks were also heavily censored by Israel prior to the late 1990s.
Yeah, and just to complete, basically since then there have been these repeated, persistent accusations being made, mainly by Israeli organizations or various kind of pro-Israel in quotation marks, or organizations for the last 20-25 years. But basically every international study or independent study that was made disproved or contradicted these allegations. They wouldn't completely like whitewash the Palestinian textbooks, saying there is nothing controversial or there's no nationalist bias in them, but they would all disprove the notion that there is widespread or systematic incitement to hatred and violence.
And what are the main allegations that have been leveled against the Palestinian curriculum? Is it incitement to violence? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it something else? All of the above?
It's exactly this: incitement to violence, anti-Semitism, glorification of terrorists. But I think if you look at the details, even in those allegations, you see that it's all really grossly exaggerated. There is some grain of truth, as in all effective propaganda, but it's exaggerated, I would say, at least tenfold. And you can see that if you look at the various international studies that have been produced on the topic over the last decades. There have been several of them.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar, just on this point of nationalism, are you familiar with any national curriculum anywhere in the world that is not nationalistic?
I think there are attempts, definitely, and I think it varies. And I think it's very much linked to the intensity of the nationalist sentiment and the context. Countries which have peaceful relations with their neighbors, naturally, there's a lesser tendency to push, this kind of nationalist content into the textbooks. While countries which are involved in conflicts or are under a foreign occupation or military occupation, of course, the context is different, and that, I think, decides everything, because the textbooks cannot be completely disconnected from the experience of the people and of the society, or from their historical experience. You cannot completely put that context aside.
And is the allegation basically that these textbooks are priming Palestinian children to reject peace and engage in violence and all the rest of it? I mean, is there an attempt in these allegations to actually draw a relationship between how children are taught in school and how they respond to the experience of living under occupation? The allegations are always, the context is erased in them. Yeah? So it's as if there was no occupation, or no systematic oppression, no systematic violations of human rights, which is the context, or historically disposition of the Palestinians, loss of their homeland. This is erased. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem of this discourse. And I don't mean only the organizations which are promoting it, but the key factor here are, in Europe, segment of politicians and parliamentarians, and the same is on the US side in the Congress, who are very eager to promote these allegations because it fits into their, I would say, pre-existing stereotypes or prejudices about the situation. And it's usually the same politicians who never, ever mention the occupation, criticize violations of human rights of the Palestinians or violations of international law. And that brings me to my next question, because your own research into this issue has led you to the conclusion that the campaign to delegitimize the Palestinian national curriculum actually has little to do with specific concerns about the textbooks that are actually used in Palestinian schools, but has everything to do with the way in which demands for curriculum reform can be used to advance a pro-Israeli political agenda, a broader political agenda. So that brings me to ask you, who were the main proponents of this agenda and what are its main elements? Right.
Look, the main proponents, you mentioned an Israeli organization at the beginning, which has been producing these allegations kind of on a yearly basis, which has in the meantime renamed or transformed itself. It is now called Impact SE. But there are a number of other organizations which use these reports and promote them. And I don't think there's anything surprising in that. It's kind of completely irrational and predictable that there will be people on the Israeli or pro-Israeli side of this situation who will be trying to delegitimize the Palestinian cause, shift the blame to them. And what I think is really the key factor here, where we should be putting our attention, is why there are quite a few European or American politicians who uncritically buy into these allegations and promote them in a very black and white form.
So you're basically saying, the allegations are kind of, or the campaign against the textbooks is kind of the typical propaganda one would expect in a conflict situation. But the real issue is the receptiveness to this campaign in political circles, particularly in Europe and the United States.
Yes, that's right. Although I think the attention to the textbook issue is also exceptional. I cannot think of any other conflict where the textbooks would be such a intense or a frequent topic of allegations. I think it's partly and it links to the well-known Israeli narrative about Palestinians teaching hatred to their children, which has been there for many years. So it's about confirming and feeding this narrative, which is a way to help justify the continued occupation, the violations of Palestinian rights, the violence which is employed against them, because it's them who are evil or teaching hatred to their children. But yeah, these things come up also in other conflicts. I have been looking into studies on Ukrainian and Russian textbooks, which is also very interesting, and there is also obviously a lot of antagonism in Ukrainian textbooks, but I cannot imagine that European politicians would be pushing Ukraine to tone down the language in their textbooks about Russia.
Yeah, well, don't hold your breath on that one. So, but what's interesting here is, you mentioned the narrative of Palestinians are teaching their children to hate. But there's, I think, maybe another element about this, which is the suggestion that if Palestinians had not been incited to oppose the occupation by the national curriculum, the textbooks, they would be at peace with being occupied, which is part of, I think, of a longer tradition in Israeli attitudes towards the Palestinians, which is saying, these people basically have nothing to complain about. And when they do act against Israel, it's always because of some outside pressure forcing them to do things which otherwise wouldn't occur to them, because they really, they have nothing really to oppose.
I think that's very much correct. The thing is, these kinds of considerations are not coming up in the European debate about this issue almost at all. Mm-hmm. It's a very, narrow, almost solipsistic debate.
Yeah, focusing on the specific allegations and treating those as extremely serious issues that need to be addressed and resolved. Yeah.
Because the only concern that, it is a legitimate concern, is about not supporting anything which would be, anti-Semitic or promoting hatred, etc. But there is no understanding for the concern kind of on the other side, which is that you are feeding this narrative and these stereotypes about the Palestinians, which are structurally, not so dissimilar from the potentially negative stereotypes about Israel or the Jewish people.
Given the duration and intensity of this campaign, how have Palestinians responded to it? How have they sought to address a campaign against their national curriculum? And particularly going back again to your earlier point, it's the adoption of its demands by prominent American and European politicians.
Right. Well, I think it's putting the Palestinians, both, the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian civil society more broadly, into a very difficult, if not impossible, situation. Because if you engage on this and you get bogged down in, responding to the different delegations, then you are already, talking about that.
You're legitimizing it as an issue.
As an issue, yes. Instead of talking about, what should be the main concern, occupation, violation of rights, etc., etc. And then, but if you do not respond, then that is a problem as well, because then there is no response to the allegations. I have to say that unfortunately, the Palestinian diplomacy, not surprisingly, maybe, has been very, very ineffective in this debate. And I would say that maybe for Palestinian society more broadly, I think it would be good to pay more attention to this debate, especially I think for analysts, intellectuals, scholars, historians, because the debate is very much about, it's not just textbooks in a narrow sense, but it's about judging and taking positions on the Palestinian narrative and Palestinian history.
Do the Palestinians have a right to their own history, effectively?
Yes. So I think, and we haven't yet spoken about the study, which is at the center of the current EU debate, which is a study produced by a German institute. We can talk about it more, Georg Eckert Institute, which is now basically treated as a kind of quasi-official EU position on the Palestinian narrative.
But it seems that particularly when we discuss the Europeans, there are two issues here. The first is kind of the debate as it exists. Let's say you have this campaign, it has demands. The demands are adopted by the Europeans, who then put pressure on the Palestinians. But there's an additional dimension, which is that the Europeans are primary funders of the Palestinian Authority budget and indirectly of the educational system and the production of these textbooks. And so, their engagement with this issue is not without consequence.
Absolutely. And that is why the EU is the main target, I think, of these accusations. And indeed, it has consequences. And currently, we have a blockage. Basically, the entire EU financial assistance to the PA, annually over 200 million euros, is currently blocked because of internal EU disputes about this textbook question. It's not a dispute between the EU and the PA, but it's an internal EU dispute, and I can explain it further. But it has real-world serious consequences.
So let's indeed look at that question in detail. As you mentioned, the most recent installment of this controversy concerns a study published last year by the German organization, the Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research, which to my understanding is considered one of the world's leading research organizations when it comes to analyzing textbooks and curricula. And this study was commissioned by the European Union, again, as part of this broader constant repetition of this controversy. but you've described it in your own words as the EU's new low point on Palestine. Why did you come to that assessment?
Well, I mean, not just the report specifically, but I mean the whole EU engagement on this matter over the last year, including the de facto suspension of aid, which has resulted from that. And the fact that this is taking more time of European policymakers in all key EU institutions, the Parliament, the Council, the Commission, than any other issue related to Israel and Palestine, such as settlements or Gaza over the last year. But specifically with regard to this report, so the report by this institute, it came about, well, initially as a result of a pressure from certain members of the European Parliament who have been, repeating and buying into these kinds of allegations about the Palestinian textbooks. The EU decided then, okay, let's do a study. But the EU, there was some consideration whether to also cover the Israeli textbooks, but the decision was made, no, let's focus only on the Palestinian ones. The reason slash excuse maybe for that is, the EU is providing financial assistance to the PA, including the PA education sector, and there's not a comparable direct support to the Israeli government, or not to the education sector specifically. But I think already that is hugely problematic because it is an inherently one-sided picture. If you only look, because of course you will find some problems, and if you only look at one side, let alone the occupied side, then it provides already inherently a biased view. And so I think the EU should have never done this, because even the US government, they produced a study 9-10 years ago, which actually compared both Israeli and Palestinian textbooks, and we can talk about that as well. And I think it is also a shame that the German Institute, which indeed is one of the most reputed ones in the world on this, that they agreed to do this kind of one-sided study, because we have experience in Europe with reconciling different conflicting narratives of different nations and different groups, plenty of experience. I think the lesson from it is that you get a degree of reconciliation through mutual dialogue, and it takes time, rather than through unilateral imposition on one side. And again, we're talking about the side which is subjected to a never-ending occupation. But if I may, just on the report itself, what it concluded, well, as I said at the beginning, just like the previous international studies, it provides a very different, much more nuanced assessment than the allegations which claim that there is, it's riddled with incitement and anti-Semitism. Now, the conclusions are very complex, and they are difficult to summarize in one sentence. And there's a tendency, people can selectively quote different parts of the report based on their pre-existing view. But it definitely, disproves this kind of very simplistic narrative about the textbooks being so bad. Maybe one thing I would say about it, besides being one-sided, I think the problem is when I read the report, it comes across as very German, the German context on this issue is very uber cautious when it comes to Israel in particular, for historical reasons. And I think you can see it also in that report. I'll give you just, so I wouldn't consider it an objective report, but it is treated as such now in the EU.
And sorry, Martin, you see two fundamental issues, just if I can interrupt you. Yeah. The first is that the Eckert Institute accepted to conduct a study of only one curriculum instead of both. And the second is that it approached this not on the basis, let's say, of Israeli-Palestinian relations, but rather it looked at Palestinian textbooks through the lens, if you will, of German-Israeli relations. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, I think there is a reflection of the German environment, German political environment for the discussion on Israel-Palestine, which is very, and in particular in the last years, is very, very constrained and cautious. And if I can just maybe illustrate it on
Please
just
do.
one example, they pull out one example from one Palestinian textbook, which they say that it amounts to, or potentially to, dehumanization of an Israeli soldier. I think it's the only example that they explicitly call dehumanization and they reviewed over 150 textbooks, and it's an example where there's a poem about in a Palestinian textbook about a Palestinian child shot and killed by an Israeli soldier, and there's a picture of Israeli soldiers pointing their gun at a picture of a Palestinian child, and the report complains that this is potentially dehumanizing the Israeli soldiers because there is too much red color on the picture. And as if these situations were not happening, as if it was not so common. Even in the last weeks, several Palestinian children and teenagers being killed in clashes, or even without any kind of without a violent situation. So I think this demonstrates the problem. Instead of talking or paying attention to the fact that children are being killed and people are being killed, the EU is today talking about how do we make sure
Pictures
that
of people
the Palestinian
being killed.
textbooks aren't too critical about this.
Right. Just returning to a point you made a few moments ago, has the EU ever undertaken a study of Israeli textbooks? And
No.
you also mentioned an American study. It would be interesting to learn who conducted it and what its conclusions were.
Yeah, it was conducted by a group of Israeli and Palestinian researchers in 2012, and it was published, I think, in 2013. And that study concluded that there is a broadly comparable level of bias and problems in the textbooks on both sides. But actually, it says that the level that of issues or of outright incitement is actually very limited in the textbooks on both sides. They said, yeah, but the level of bias broadly comparable. In some instances, the Israeli textbooks were a little bit better. In some other instances, the Palestinian ones.
And was a study undertaken in the context of, I believe it was called the Incitement Committee, or a joint Israeli-Palestinian committee set up at some point in, was it the late 90s or early 2000s, to address these issues? Has it been studied there as well?
No, because the Incitement Committee didn't work out, because the Israeli government was opposed to the continuation of that work.
Even though it demanded its formation?
Well, it demanded that the issue of the incitement is addressed, but they wanted this to be applied unilaterally to the Palestinian side. And when a trilateral committee was established, the Israelis were not happy with that, because it kind of puts them at the same level, or subject to the same standards.
Trilateral being Israeli-Palestinian American?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the Israelis, on the one hand, objected to basically having Palestinian concerns about Israeli incitement addressed as well. And then, if I understand you, at a later stage, simply walked away from this committee?
Yeah, there was an attempt. I think there were a few rounds, but then it collapsed very quickly. So I think they didn't undertake any studies. And I think, look, beyond this US study, which I mentioned, there are other studies, and there's, for example, a study by an Israeli researcher and activist, Nurit Peled, from about 12 years ago, which actually takes different conclusions. She has much harsher criticism of the Israeli textbooks. Yeah, so there are different views, but in the EU debate, this is not present at all. The focus is simply
exclusively on the Palestinian curriculum. Yeah, and that brings me to a current issue, which is that looking also at your own writings on the Eckert Institute EU episode, you focus specifically on the role of the Hungarian European Union Commissioner for Neighborhood and Enlargement, Oliver Varhelyi. What is his relationship to this issue? Does this issue fall under neighborhood and enlargement? If not, what is his agenda, and to what extent has he been able to achieve his goals?
Yes, no, Mr. Varhelyi is the central player, really, who's driving this issue in Brussels, in the EU institutions, in particular in the Commission, but also the Council, the member states. And so he is.
Sorry, just to clarify, the European Commission is kind of
like a government,
the government of the European Union.
So a commissioner is like a minister. And he is in charge of EU neighborhood, which also involves the funding for the neighborhood countries. So that's why his role is important. And so basically, when this report was completed by the Georg Eckert Institute, he has since then sought to play up the issue, put a more negative spin on the results, and to promote the idea of introducing conditionality of EU funds for the Palestinian Authority on changing the textbooks. And this has resulted into a major internal dispute within the EU institutions and with EU member states, which has been only growing and growing. And as a result of this dispute, all the financial assistance to the PA is blocked at the moment.
And this is because Varhelyi has the power to basically suspend the funding. Is that right?
Well, it's not that simple. It's because you need an approval of member states and of other players in the Commission, and because people are divided on this issue, including member states which are broadly opposing this proposal for conditionality. As a result, the things are stuck. There is a dispute, and therefore the money cannot be released. It's not that Varhelyi is single-handedly blocking EU funds because of the textbooks. It's because he has put forward this very divisive proposal and has been advancing it despite strong and growing opposition at every step over the last months in a kind of very determined way, which means that the dispute has just grown and grown, and the money cannot be released. I would, if I may, say one more thing, which is, there is no conditionality of the funding for the PA on issues that, I think anyone would consider of greater concern, such as human rights violations or the lack of elections by the PA. So introducing it specifically on the textbooks is, and kind of suggesting that this should be the priority over these, what I think I would call much more important and fundamental concerns, I think that doesn't make sense in terms of foreign policy. And maybe one more thing I would say, he's a Hungarian commissioner. He was nominated by Viktor Orbán. So, and it's by far not the only step or position that he has taken to kind of position himself or profile himself as the best friend of Israel and Israel-aligned organizations in the EU. For example, his department has also suspended funding for Palestinian NGOs who have been accused by the Israeli government of links to terrorism. Already before the designation,
designated organization.
Already before, a few months before that. So it's a series of these kind of steps, and one cannot disconnect it from the fact, that Hungary under Viktor Orban has aligned itself very closely and visibly with the Israeli government, with also Republicans in the US under the Trump administration. It all comes together, and the remarkable thing in this regard that Hungary itself under Orban has introduced a very nationalist school curriculum at home, which includes promotion of authors, Hungarian authors from the wartime period, who were clearly anti-Semitic and who were not, on the kind of compulsory literature list before. While
Hungary was aligned with Nazi Germany.
Yes. And while some other authors, prominent authors who wrote about the Holocaust, received a Nobel Literature Prize, have been removed from the curriculum. But nobody is paying attention to this or talking about it.
But the consequence of what Varhelyi has done, if I understood you correctly, is not simply to delay or block European Union financial support for the Palestinian educational system, but all funding for the Palestinian Authority. Is that correct?
Yes, but it's an effective consequence. That's not like I don't know what his intention was.
It's an impact.
Sorry?
It's not a decision, it's a consequence.
Yes, exactly. And the idea that he's promoting is that a portion of the assistance, maybe 10 million per year, would be conditional, not that the whole aid is blocked. The whole
but
aid
until
is
that is resolved, all
Absolutely.
The aid is being blocked. Yeah.
Yes, but yes, the blockage is a result of him pushing this issue without and despite strong opposition from other players in the system. So it's not like he has nothing to do with the consequences of his actions.
Oh, of course, they're direct consequences of his actions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Looking more broadly, the Palestinian textbook controversy appears to be part of a broader campaign to delegitimize the Palestinians, and as you indicated, in so doing, perpetuate Israel's impunity towards them and its lack of accountability for its policies. There's also another campaign that has been consistently in the news, particularly during the Trump-Kushner years, and that is the campaign to either defund or outright abolish the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. Do you see a relationship between these two issues?
Yes, of course. And the textbook issue has been one of the ways to attack UNRWA and to push for defunding of UNRWA. And the allegations about the textbooks have been used also in the US, both in the context of the Trump administration defunding, but also now when Biden administration has come back and has reintroduced funding for UNRWA to push back on the administration from the Congress. And in the EU, the UNRWA has also been attacked because of this issue, but they are, let's say, one step removed because they do not produce the textbooks themselves. They use the textbooks of the host governments, whether it's in Jordan or Lebanon, and in the Palestinian areas they use the PA textbooks, but they so they do not produce them themselves, but they also adapt them in the sense that they give additional guidance to teachers, especially with regard to some of these passages which may be controversial. But there's a difference, because UNRWA is not a national authority. It's a UN institution. So I think the PA cannot be judged by exactly the same standards, or there cannot be the same expectations as you might have towards UNRWA. So I think the PA cannot simply copy the UNRWA model.
And that has to do with, for example, UNRWA raising certain issues in its own adaptation of the curriculum that perhaps the Palestinian Ministry of Education would consider, to use a simple word, irrelevant to its own priorities.
Yeah, and the PA is, look, the textbooks are being constantly reviewed. There are different changes. The Georg Eckert Institute report has acknowledged that in the last edition of the textbooks, there were significant changes, which removed some of the more problematic, some of the more controversial content. And there is now a process on the side of the PA to set up a kind of curriculum center, which would oversee further reforms of the curriculum, but supposedly in a way which would be kind of owned by the Palestinians themselves.
Looking at this campaign and the demands that are made, one sometimes gets the impression that the critics will only be satisfied if the Palestinians adopt the Israeli curriculum as their own and teach the Israeli curriculum to their children, which brings me to my final question. What, in your view, would an effective response to this campaign look like? And specifically, you mentioned that there's kind of a catch-22 situation. If you respond to the allegations, you're diverting attention from the fundamental issues that are at stake here. And if you don't respond to them, you're in effect accepting their accuracy. So how would one formulate an effective response to this campaign?
Yeah, look, I don't have a silver bullet on that, but I would say when it comes to this dilemma of engaging or not engaging, I would argue that there should be more engagement in the sense of greater response to the allegations, maybe more independent analysis by Palestinians, by Palestinian academics, or by international scholars, because without it, the Georg Eckert Institute now has a sort of a monopoly on defining the position on the Palestinian narrative. And I'm not sure, or I don't think it's an objective position. And at the same time, I would say this Palestinian reform process is also, part of a response. And changing the textbooks, as long as the process is owned by the Palestinians, and making some changes which are in line with universal humanistic values, rather limited changes in my view, would, I think, also help address this issue. As you said, the critics or the proponents of the allegations, they will never be satisfied. They will always allege that the textbooks are terrible and they are just getting worse. But if the objective situation, if the little grain of truth in this propaganda is reduced, then I think it will diffuse the issue to an extent. I would also say, what I didn't mention before, it's a difficult situation also for the Palestinians because they are dependent financially on the EU. And the EU is looking at it through the prism of, its own taxpayer interest. And there's very little concern for the Palestinian perspective, for the Palestinian experience, Palestinian narrative. There's only strong concern about, not promoting anything that could smack of anti-Semitism or promotion of hatred.
But that strikes me as the fundamental issue here, which is not so much responding to critics who, as you said, will by definition never be satisfied because they're actually engaged in promoting a political rather than educational agenda. But the real challenge, it seems to me, is how do you get the European Union to put this issue in its proper perspective and to address it in a reasonable manner, rather than, as you've explained today, this one-sided focus on the occupied rather than the occupier. And you mentioned the importance of doing independent studies and so on. But if we're in a situation where the European Commission is going to keep commissioning studies along the lines of the Eckert Institute, how does one break through that obstacle?
I don't have a magic solution to that. I think at the moment there's so little independent analysis, except for older things like this U.S. comparative study. But there has also not been a proper. I haven't seen any Palestinian scholar review the Georg Eckert report. That would be at least something which would be relevant for the conversation in Europe if there was a certain counterpoint on that. But at the moment, we are missing even that.
Yeah. Martin Konečný, thank you very much for sharing your insight and expertise with Connections. It was really a great conversation. Thank you.
Pleasure, and hope we can talk about some other issue next time.
Thank you.